Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to go on an absolute intellectual epic today. It's a journey that basically reverse engineers the very foundations of modern capitalism and global commerce. Now, we aren't going to be looking at massive armies or famous kings or legendary explorers. Instead, we are focusing on something much more potent: the power of ideas. We're going to trace this invisible underground network of knowledge that started in a dusty 16th century classroom in France and somehow blossomed into the most iconic metropolis in the modern world. I mean, it's a wild question, isn't it? Seriously, how does a man who never crossed an ocean, who never commanded a single soldier, and who never signed a colonial treaty become the true secret architect of the modern world? How on earth did a professor hunched over crumbling ancient manuscripts manage to write the source code for a global trading empire and a city of skyscrapers? Well, let's find out. Okay, let's dive right into this. The man represented by this remarkably modest crest is Jacques Cujas. He was born in Toulouse, France, way back in 1522. And what makes his story absolutely incredible right out of the gate is his background. He wasn't born into nobility or wealth. Not at all. He was the son of a modest tanner. His climb from the harsh smells of a 16th century tannery to the most prestigious academic chairs in Europe was just completely fraught with personal difficulties, family struggles, and intense university rivalries. But his self-taught genius prevailed. He learned Greek and Latin at lightning speed, eventually rising to the absolute top of the incredibly closed-off world of 16th century law. So that brings us to our first major milestone: the Bourges Revolution and the birth of modern reading. To truly understand how this man's mind eventually shaped the Americas, we have to look at the University of Bourges, which was one of his stops during his academic wanderings across Europe. In the 1500s, his simple classroom literally became the intellectual capital of the world. Cujas, who became known as the Prince of Jurisconsults, was, at his core, a radical reader. At the time, ancient Roman law formed the bedrock of all European justice. But Cujas realized something shocking. People weren't actually reading the original Roman laws anymore. They were just blindly accepting layers upon layers of medieval commentary. It was like a giant game of historical telephone. Cujas stripped all of that away. He demanded intense philological rigor and real historical context to uncover the actual truth of the texts. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer contrast between these two eras of thought. On the left, you've got the old way, the mos italicus. This was a system that just piled up medieval glosses, and it produced blind obedience to ancient authority. Basically, the older a commentary was, the more it was accepted as absolute truth. But on the right, we have Cujas' massive revolution, the mos gallicus, or the French method. He demanded a full return to the pure original text. He started treating law as a historical document that requires actual evidence, completely introducing the concept of scientific doubt into the legal world. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this three-step method completely destroyed ancient, unquestioned authority. By demanding primary sources, deeply understanding the political climate of the original era, and applying a fierce critical spirit, Cujas shifted the entire world from relying on blind dogma to establishing scientific proof. He taught his students a fundamentally subversive idea that changed history forever. Never, ever just take someone's word for it. You have to verify it yourself. Which leads us directly into Section 2, the exile of the method and a massive historical diaspora. You see, this brilliant method was born in an incredibly dangerous time. Outside the walls of Cujas' quiet classroom, France was literally being torn apart by the brutal violence of the wars of religion. This new intellectual software had to be exported just to survive. We can kind of view this timeline as a high-stakes historical relay race. Notice the tragic murder of Denis Dujon in Issoudun. When his son, François Dujon, who was deeply steeped in the Cujasian method, fled that religious violence, he didn't just pack his clothes. He packed Cujas's critical method and carried it with him into exile. François Dujon eventually took this method to the newly founded University of Leiden in the Netherlands. Known as the bastion of liberty, Leiden became an incredible intellectual haven. Dujon took Cujas's strict philological rigor, which remember was originally used for Roman law, and did something amazingly bold. He applied it to the Bible. By treating sacred texts with rigorous study rather than blind dogma, Leiden became training a brand new, highly pragmatic global elite. These students learned how to govern through texts and rules, fostering a society based on regulated, legal coexistence rather than endless holy wars. All right, let's move into our third section, the Vossius dynasty. where we see this science put into action. But you might be wondering, how exactly do we get from reading old texts in a university to actually building a massive colonial empire? Well, that bridge was built by the Vossius dynasty. The method basically became a transmissible family heritage when François Dujon's daughter, Elizabeth, married Gerard Vossius. Their son, Isaac Vossius, inherited this deeply critical mindset. But here's the kicker. He applied his grandfather's exact textual method to the physical world. He used it to accurately map oceans, understand the tides, and perfect global navigation. I absolutely love this concept. The natural world became readable, just like a text. The awe-inspiring transition here is that the exact same critical reading skills that Jacques Cujas used to decode dusty Roman manuscripts in Bourges were now being used by Isaac Vossius to navigate the entire globe safely and profitably. It's a brilliant leap. To dominate the seas, you must first map them, and to govern effectively, you have to understand the rules. Now, Section 4 is where things get incredibly pragmatic: capitalism via law and the rise of the trading companies. This intellectual rigor directly programmed the administrative software of global commerce. The leaders of massive maritime companies like the Dutch East India Company and the West India Company were trained right there at Leiden. They took Cujas's humanist Roman law and used it to literally invent legal capitalism. They created these massive shipping companies that held public powers, shared their risk through stock, and realized that huge power could be delegated through carefully written contracts. They figured out how to govern from thousands of miles away without having to rely purely on expensive brute force warfare. And finally, we hit Section 5, the contract city and the birth of Manhattan. We have finally arrived at the destination of our relay race, where the highly abstract academic theory of a Bourges classroom directly meets the gritty colonial reality of the Hudson River. When we contrast these two colonial approaches, a stark difference emerges. The Iberian empires of Spain and Portugal largely expanded through military conquest and secret narratives. But the Dutch, carrying the DNA of Cujas's teachings, designed New Amsterdam as a legal hypothesis. They focused heavily on property titles, legal possession, and negotiation. For them, law became a literal technology of expansion. Which brings us right to 1626. Peter Minuit, representing the West India Company, purchases the island of Manhattan for the equivalent of 60 guilders. Notice what's happening here. He wasn't acting as a warlord. He was acting as a Cujassian administrator. He was applying that exact university logic to formalize possession purely through a contract. Now, however imperfect that mutual understanding with the indigenous population may have been at the time, the Dutch intention was to substitute a legal agreement for brute violence. New York was literally born from an act, a commercial contract, an archive. And this brilliantly illustrates the core message of this entire epic history: the victory of method over institution. Now, Jacques Cujas died in 1590, long before Peter Minuit ever set foot on Manhattan. But New York is undeniably the ultimate daughter of French legal humanism. It is a metropolis built entirely on the revolutionary idea that the world can be organized by reason, by contracts, and by law, provided you actually know how to read the sources with clarity. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. We've traced how a humble tanner's son from Toulouse changed the entire way we read, how his method survived brutal religious wars, mapped the global oceans, and literally built the legal, contractual foundations of New York City. The power of a deeply critical, evidence-based mindset is absolutely world-altering. So if the modern world is built by reading ancient texts critically, how are you reading the contracts, the news, and the hidden rules that govern your life today? Are you just blindly taking someone's word for it, or are you looking at the primary source? Thanks so much for joining our analysis today. I'll see you next time.